All right, we started a couple of weeks ago on the podcast talking about the moral argument for God's existence, which is an apologetic topic, of course, which just means a defense of the faith, offering a defense for why we believe what we believe. And we talked about the cosmological argument a few months ago and then had some requests to do some more apologetic type things. And so we have done a couple of weeks on the moral argument. And for the YouTube audience benefit, I'll sum up those 2 weeks basically and then get into the other stuff. But the idea is basically this. For instance, if I was to leave here after I get done working and head towards my house, turn right out of the church on 144 and drive 58 miles an hour, and then get to that red light by the Jacks in Ohatchee and don't come to the stop at the red light, but go ahead and make the turn, and then don't use my blinker, of course, because whoever uses a blinker, and then call my wife, tell her I'm going to be a little late. I have to stay at the office a little later. And then I go cheat on her with somebody else. And then I go back home and I sit out in my garage and turn my music up loud in my neighborhood. And then I go to bed. What was the worst thing that I did today? What was the worst thing I did on my way home? Now, it's laughable, right, to even ask that question. And that's an interesting thing, by the way, is to ask why you find things humorous. It's laughable to think anything that I did on my way home could be anything close to comparing to cheating on my wife as the obvious worst thing that I did. But the only thing I did on the way home that was not actually illegal that I listed to you was cheating on my wife. I didn't use my blinker. That's illegal. I can get pulled over for that. Rolled through a stop sign, drove 58 and a 55, turned my music up too loud in my neighborhood, disturbed the peace. Things that I could actually be accused of that are actually illegal and against the law. But the one thing that was not against the law is the one thing that I did that is quite obviously and even humorously the worst of those things. What the moral argument is doing is asking, why do we think those things are worse than other things? Why, in fact, do we think anything is worse than anything else? Are some things good and some things bad, some things right and some things wrong? We seem to think so. And the question that the moral argument is dealing with is, why is that the case? Right? Is it better to help people or to hurt people? Is it better to be selfish or to be selfless? Is slavery better or not slavery better? Is equality better or racism better? Is love better or is hate better? When you answer each one of those questions, you are making a moral judgment. You're making a judgment about what is better or worse, what is right or wrong, what should or should not happen. And the question, of course, is why is that the case? Why is it better to help people than to hurt people? Why in the world do you think it's better to be selfless? Why do you find it more admirable when someone is selfless? Why do you find it easier to be around somebody who is selfless than somebody who is selfish? Who is a better person, Hitler or Mother Teresa? Based on what? Was the Holocaust wrong? Was 9/11 wrong? The idea of this argument is that you know the answer to these things because there's a law that has been written on your hearts. Laws that are always given by lawgivers has been written on your heart that says certain things are right and certain things are wrong. It's not physical like the law of the land. It's more like the law of math, or the law of logic. And that law is referred to as the moral law. And the moral argument traditionally, given by William Lane Craig, for instance, goes something like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore God exists. So premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore, since they do exist, God exists. Now, interestingly, what was the primary method of attacking this sort of argument for a long time was by attacking premise number 2. And it's still the method in our moral relativistic society, in our postmodern society. It's still a method, though it seems to be that we're moving away from those ideas. Now we've moved more into, or at least it seems that we're moving towards people attacking premise number 1, granting the fact that objective moral values and duties exist, but wanting to argue that they can exist without the existence of God. And the reason that we're moving that direction is because it's so hard for you to deny that inside you feel things are really and truly wrong and really and truly right, that it's more than just your preferences. Now, I should say, we should deal with this quickly, that the word objective in the argument is a key one, obviously. Objective just means that it's not based on your opinions. It is not subject to you. It is above that. It transcends your opinions and your thoughts, right? So for instance, if I was to ask what the best ice cream is to you, and if I was to ask what the best ice cream is to 10 other people, I'd probably get 10 different answers or something like that. I'd get more than one answer, surely. And if I was to ask you what your favorite, or what the best ice cream is, I should say, and you give the answer chocolate, that is subjectively true. That is true for you, but not true for everyone of all times. It's not my favorite, for instance. Cookies and cream, of course, which is the objective right answer. But subjectively, to you, chocolate is the best ice cream, or whatever you think it is. Right? So it's subjectively true that you have an opinion on ice cream flavors about which one is best. It is objectively true that 2 + 2 = 4. Right? Math is objective. That is, no matter what your opinion is on it, that's the truth. 2 + 2 = 4. And so this argument is saying that there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. And that the idea of right and wrong itself is that there's an objectivity to it, that there are such things that are right and wrong. It's not really about what in particular is right and wrong, as much as it is saying that there are certain things that are right and certain things that are indeed wrong, that there is an objectivity to morality. And the reason that people like Sam Harris is a big one, are trying to establish objective morality without God is because it's so difficult to deny the fact that objective morality exists. It's so difficult to deny that inside you feel there are really certain things that are right and wrong, and that even in some sense you're going to be judged for the way that you live your life. Right? That there are those feelings inside of you that are undeniable. Craig says, in fact, that he finds the moral argument to be the most persuasive to most people he talks to, though it's not his favorite, nor mine really. But he finds it to be most persuasive because it's just so hard to deny those things that you that seems so obvious to you. That it's so obvious that there are certain things that are right and certain things are wrong. J. Budzievsky, a professor at the University of Texas, says it well. He says, everyone knows certain principles. There's no land, for instance, where murder is virtue and gratitude is vice, where unlawful killing is considered virtuous and being thankful and grateful is considered vice, where someone is offended to you or is angry at you or thinks you've done something wrong if you say thank you, if you express a grateful nature. C.S. Lewis, in this line of thinking, in fact, one of the things that played a key role in C.S. Lewis's conversion. C.S. Lewis says this: think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. And then he says, you might as well try to imagine a country where 2 + 2 = 5. That it'd be that difficult to imagine such a place. Because the truth is that everything in us points to the reality of objective morality, that there are certain things that are right and wrong. There's such a thing as fairness and justice, and then unjustness or injustice. And of course, everyone wants to call certain things wrong. Everyone's upset about something being wrong. But this argument is saying that if you're going to be upset about certain things being wrong, then you have to believe that a God that exists, that called that thing wrong, that made it wrong, that declared it wrong. And none of those are actually the right words, but that simply they're wrong because it is against that God's nature. There's an illustration that goes like this. A student writes a paper in a freshman level ethics class at college, and the paper assigned to them was to write a paper on whether morality was objective or subjective, whether there's such thing as right and wrong. And this student wrote a very well-written paper, an A+ level paper, about the subjectivity of morality, that nothing's really right and wrong. There's no such thing really as justice and injustice. No such thing really as fair and unfair. And he goes even to the extra effort and buys a nice blue folder and puts the paper in a folder and turns it in to the professor at the front of the class. The next class period, the class meets, and he receives back his folder, graded, and it has a big F on it with a big red circle around it. And underneath the F, it says, I do not like blue folders. And of course, the student is livid and goes to the professor's office after class, irate that the professor has done this. And what does he say? He says, you can't do this. Right? It's not fair for you to give me an F on a paper that I worked very hard on an A+ paper because you don't like blue folders. You can't do that. And the professor looks at him and says, now I read a lot of papers. Was yours the paper that says there's no such thing as fair and unfair? No such thing as just and unjust? And the student says, yes, that was me. And the professor says, I don't like blue folders. And of course, the lesson is obvious, is that we can reason ourselves if we want to hold on to our atheistic beliefs or fight the existence of God. We can reason ourselves into the place where we argue a subjective morality, but we really don't believe it. We don't live that way. We don't actually ever live the way that says, I believe certain things are not right and wrong, that I don't believe in anything is right and anything is wrong, and you should or should not. We can't live that way, and everything in us points to the contrary. We believe certain things are fair and certain things are unfair. Moral relativist wife who believes there's no such thing as right and wrong comes home to a moral relativist husband who believes the same things, who is cheating on her. Does she say, well, he likes vanilla and I like chocolate? It's just preferences, really. No, she thinks what the husband's doing is wrong. And that, of course, contradicts everything in us when we succumb to the idea of relativism, which says there's no such thing as right and wrong, no such thing as true and untrue, which, of course, contradicts itself, because if that statement's true, then there is such thing as truth. You can't know 2 + 2 = 5 unless you know 2 + 2 = 4. So moving kind of into the next idea is that the only way you can ever say anything is wrong is if something is right. C.S. Lewis, another quote of his, it says, as an atheist, and he's talking about his conversion, he says, as an atheist, my argument against God was that this world seemed so unjust. But where had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If I was to write on the board 2 + 2 = 5 and ask you if that was correct, you could say that it wasn't correct, that it was wrong, because you know what the right answer is. But if I was to write on my board some very complicated calculus equation and say, give me an answer right now, and you aren't a math genius. Or if I said at the bottom the answer is 7x, and ask you if that was the right answer and gave you a second to answer, you would have to say that you didn't know. And the reason you don't know if that answer is wrong is because you don't know what the right answer is. In order to know what the wrong answer is, or if anything is wrong, you have to know what is right. And the same thing is true morally. In order to say anything is wrong, you must know that there is something right. In order to say any line is crooked, you must have some idea of what a straight line looks like. You must have some sort of objective standard you are comparing it to. You must have a straight line in your mind that says that line is not straight. You must have 4 in your mind that says 2 + 2 does not equal 5. In order to say something, it's wrong to act in a certain way, you must have something that is right that says that is to the contrary, that you're comparing it against and saying it doesn't look like that much. For instance, if you had 2 pictures of balls of various types, perhaps a football and a baseball, and I said, which one of these pictures is a better example of a football? You would point to the football. Right? Because what you do in your mind is you draw up in your mind a comparison of what you've seen as footballs before, and you say, which one of these pictures is more like that picture I have in my mind of what a football looks like? All right, let me give you a different example. If I said, who looks more like George Clooney? Me or Jar Jar Binks? What do you do in that moment when I ask you a question like that to make a judgment about which one looks more like? What you do in that moment is you draw up in your mind a picture of George Clooney, and then you pull up the picture of me that you're looking at currently and a picture of Jar Jar Binks that you've seen before, and you say, which one of those is more like that picture of George Clooney that is the standard of what it means to be George Clooney-ness? And you compare us based on that standard, right? In order to make any sort of judgment, saying one thing is better than something else, you have to have some sort of standard to compare it to. You do that with everything. In order to say anything is better than something else, in order to say one picture of a football is better than another picture of a football, you have to have a standard of what it means to look like a football. And the same thing is true morally. In order to make any sort of moral judgment about what is right or what is wrong, and to use this example more clearly, about something being better or worse, you have to have some standard you are comparing that to. For instance, when I say who is a better person, Hitler or Mother Teresa, what are you doing in your mind? Because you answer Mother Teresa if you're an honest person. But what do you do to come to that answer? How is that true? You don't realize you're doing it, but what you're doing actually is comparing Mother Teresa and Hitler to some standard and saying which one is a better picture of that standard. Now, without God, what in the world is that standard? What in the world is the thing that you're going to compare it to? The Christian answer, of course, is that you are comparing Mother Teresa and Hitler to God. And maybe even further down to what God intends for mankind to be, right? But really, ultimately, it is God you're comparing. And you're saying, when you say Mother Teresa is a better person than Hitler, you're saying Mother Teresa is more like God than Hitler. When you say it is better to help people than to hurt people, you are saying helping people is more like God than hurting people. When you say it's better to love than to hate, you're saying it's more like God to love than it is to hate. You're comparing them to this objective standard of God. And without such an objective standard, you can never say anything was better or worse than anything else. You can never say anything was right or anything was wrong. So the point of this argument is that if you want to say certain things are right and wrong, if you actually believe certain things are right and wrong, and good and evil, good and bad, then you must posit some sort of objective standard, and the only standard that you can posit to make sense of such things and to give meaning and grounding and ontology to such things is God himself. Similarly, one of the things you hear a lot is, I can't believe in God because there's too much evil in the world, something like that. I can't believe in God because there's too much evil in the world. But I heard Ravi Zacharias, who made good arguments in his lifetime. I heard Ravi Zacharias one time talk about this. I may have been at Princeton in a question and answer session. Someone said this to him, and he should have been responded. And I can't believe in God because there's too much evil in the world. And the problem with that he pointed out is this, is that if you're admitting there's such a thing as evil, which you do by the nature of the objection, you're admitting such a thing as good, right? The alternative to evil, otherwise everything's evil. And if you're admitting good and evil, then you must admit some sort of moral law in order to differentiate between the two. Otherwise, how would you know which one was which, right? You're claiming to know that some things are good and some things are evil, but how do you know which one is which without some sort of moral law? And so if you have evil, you have good. And if you have good and evil, then you have a moral law. And if you have a moral law, then like every other law, it was given by something, or in this case, someone. And so you end up arguing for the moral law giver when you say you're upset about the evil that you wish that he would stop. End up arguing for the existence of God by saying, I can't believe in God because there's too much evil in the world. Then you end up arguing against him. And there's a question there about how we know that the moral law giver must be God, right? Why does the moral law need a moral law giver? And there's a few ways to talk about that, but one of them is objective moral values and duties must be from God, because objective moral values and duties are intrinsic to persons, right? It's a person intrinsic thing, which we'll look at more in a moment. But there is no such thing as morality without persons. It doesn't just exist in some sort of floaty substance out in the universe. Morality, right and wrong, moral law, that it only makes sense inside of personhood. It doesn't apply to things. So things like fairness and generosity and love and kindness and goodwill and loyalty are virtues that belong to persons, right? A plant, for instance, can't be virtuous. A chair, I'm just pointing at things in the room. A chair can't be loyal, right? Not in the actual sense of the word. The good of Plato must be embodied in a person, which we call God. To have a duty, to have a duty is to owe something, right? To have a moral duty given by the moral law is to owe something. To be owed is an obligation, which can only come from a command of a personal being, right? You have personal, morality is inherently personal and makes no sense outside of personhood. And so in order to have a moral law, you must have it given by, in that context of personhood. And if it's going to be objective, then it has to be something above that moral law. Get to that more in a minute, I guess. Well, we'll go ahead and talk about it now. Could morality just have been a part of evolution, right? Couldn't the moral law just have been part of evolution, just like a herd instinct, right? Sure, it could have, but it doesn't seem to be the best explanation. And this is really why I think, as Stephen Meyer says, the best moral arguments are the abductive ones, which means that morality is best explained by God. That's the best way to go at the moral argument, because I mean, it's possible that morality came from evolution, but it doesn't seem likely. It certainly doesn't seem to be the best explanation, and you certainly aren't left with anything that mirrors objectivity, that is objective, or any real reason to listen to your inner moral law. Right? If the moral law is created by the ones that are succumbing to it, then it's not objective, right? It's subjective. It was created by the ones who are bowing to it, which is hard to imagine, that you are obligating yourself to yourself. Anyway, we say, so the herd instinct says, you should do it for mankind, whatever that thing is. right? That's where good and evil comes from. You should do it for the good of mankind. Why? Why should I do it, right? If someone wants to murder somebody, if someone breaks into your home tonight and wants to murder your child in front of you, and you're going to use the herd instinct sort of thinking. Obviously, this is a hypothetical because you just shoot them, as you should. You're going to use the herd instinct thinking to convince them not to. You're going to say, you shouldn't do this. Why should the murderer not kill your child? Let's assume this murderer is never going to get caught, right? That happens. And the murderer knows that. He's the best murderer there's ever been. Why should the murderer not kill your child? Morally, why should the murderer not kill your child? You say it was for the good of mankind, Buy into the herd instinct. The man says, nah, I'm not doing that. Is there any ground that you could say, well, you should do that? He should do that? You should do it for the good of mankind? Why? And if he says, I'm not going to, and kills your child and gets away with it, has he done anything wrong? Or you just don't like it like you don't like vanilla? Will he ever face any retribution? Or he just gets away with it forever? And by the way, if the deepest instincts in me, if morality is driven by evolution and the deepest instincts in me are aimed only at my survival, then, for instance, if I'm going home today and I see a child drowning in a lake that I probably could save, but I'd be risking my life to do so, is there a should there? Right? Is there something I should do in that situation? Or is it just a preference? Right? In my particular case, right, it seems evolution would drive me to save myself instead of not risk my own life, especially for the life of the weak one who found himself in such a precarious situation. Is there a should there? That I should go after that child even though I'm risking my own life? What if I know the child's going to harm somebody? Should I go after the child? What if the child has severe Down syndrome and is going to offer nothing to society, is going to do nothing but drain his family's income and emotion? Should I go after the child? Is there a should there at all? Additionally, is evolution something that itself evolved with us? Before I make that point, let me continue on that at all. If evolution, which according to the way atheism thinks, is sovereign and all-knowing and incredibly, unimaginably powerful to make its will come to pass, if evolution is aimed at the good of mankind and specifically meaning the survival of mankind, the good of the gene pool, then why don't we just kill all the old folks and who are just suckling off the system, and all those with Down syndrome or with any other mental retardations that cause them to be a drain on society? Let's kill them all. Genocide. Seems like that would be better for humanity. Let's get rid of all possible genetic deformations, abnormalities. Let's get rid of them all. That way mankind will progress to the further stages of evolution. That was kind of Hitler's idea, right? If what's at the bottom of me is evolution, that shouldn't feel as absurdly wrong as it does. Why is that grotesque to think about if what's at the bottom of me is evolution, whether I'm a Christian or not? Why is it grotesque to think about the idea of killing all those with genetic abnormalities? Okay, now, into the sort of Euthyphro dilemma question. Is evolution something that itself evolved with us, right? And is therefore by nature subjective because it came along with us, right? It's not something out there on its own accord. And again, derived from the processes that are aimed at our survival, not evolutionary processes, not aimed at truth, right? Plantinga argues that very well, which he argues that we should doubt our reasoning capacities if all of our reasoning capacities are just the product of something aimed at survival and not truth. But if such a system aimed at survival and not truth and not goodness is what caused morality, then it is entirely subjective, and why in the world should we listen to it? Why trust such an evolved system? Or, as some say, alternatively, is morality something that exists on its own, and we evolved into seeing it? Right? It exists on its own in an objective way. It objectively exists, and we evolved to the place that we could recognize it, that we could find it, that we could see it, and we could understand it. If that was the case, then where in the world did it come from? This objective floating morality out there. certainly isn't material, right? So materialism and naturalism has a difficult time with those things as they are. But where did this lump of objective morality come from? And still, again, why in the world should we listen to it? Also, if there's no God, then actual morality could not be grounded in any sort of guaranteed retribution, right? I mean, any guaranteed that will be paid back for what will happen. And if the parent never comes home, then why does the child stop acting up? If the parent never disciplines, then why does the child stop acting up? Why should he? Why should the child stop eating all the chocolate that he wants if the parent never gets on to him for it? The parent can say, don't do it. Don't eat all the chocolate in the house. But the kid does it, and it's great. And the parent says, I'm going to discipline you, but never does. Then why in the world should the child not do that and keep doing it and keep just doing whatever it takes for his pleasure? To increase his pleasure at the negation of the pleasure of everybody else. Why would it matter anyway if there is no retribution? You should do it for the good of mankind. Why? I won't. Should they? Should people do things for the good of mankind? Why in the world should they? In 1979, famously on this topic, Yale law professor Arthur Leff offered the defining question of what's been called the grand says who. He wrote, all I can say is this, and he's talking about moral relativism and trying to ground morality in God, but realizing, not in God, but in something besides God, wanting to say it's objective, but having no understanding of why. If everyone's free to make up his or her own truths, right and wrongs, on what basis can we live and act? Here's what he wrote in conclusion. He said, all I can say is this, it looks as if we are all we have. Given what we know about ourselves and each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears that if all men are brothers, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. Neither reason, nor love, nor even terror seems to have worked to make us good. And worse than that, there is no reason why anything should. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us, could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things stand now, everything's up for grabs. And he finishes like this. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up and died resisting Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, have earned salvation. Those who acquiesced deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. And then he writes, altogether now, says who? Says who? Right? Admitting there, he knows those things are true, that napalming babies is bad, that what Hitler did was wrong, that those who fought against him were good. But why? Based on what? The grand says who? Especially after all, since Hitler was just trying to push us to the next area of evolution, at least in part. So we talked about the cosmological argument on the podcast weeks ago, and we talked about objective, empirical, scientific facts that argue for the beginning of the universe, and then the philosophical point that goes along with that causes have effects, that every effect has a cause, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and therefore, since the universe began, God must have caused it, or something quite large must have caused it. This argument, the moral argument, argues differently. That says basically the way we know objective moral values and duties exist is basically from our personal experience, right? How could you know it outside of that since it's not a material thing? It's basically from our personal experience. And just as we believe in the physical objects around us by our senses, so we can believe in objective moral values and duties on the basis of our moral senses and experiences. So, for instance, I believe this desk is here because I can feel it, I can see it, I can hear it when I hit it. Right? My senses are telling me, my physical senses are telling me that this desk exists. To use a further example, my senses are telling me that out my window, right over there, is a telephone pole. I can see it with my eyes. And I have every reason, in the absence of a defeater that convinces me that they're not telling me the truth, I have every reason to believe that my physical senses are telling me the truth. I have every reason to believe that light pole out there is actually there. Because I have nothing that convinces me otherwise. I have no defeater in that regard. But If someone was to come today and show me that actually what was going on is behind my window was a lifelike picture that showed a telephone pole, but that telephone pole actually wasn't there, and they moved that picture out of the way, and there's an ocean out there. Not an ocean, but there's just grass. Then that would be a defeater, and I would have reason to not trust my physical senses that showed me that that was a light pole, right? The same thing is true of our moral senses. Without the presence of such a defeater that says that this is not true, we have every reasonable reason to believe that what our moral senses are telling us are true, that there are certain things are right and wrong, and that which things are those things. We have every reason to believe that our moral senses are telling us the truth. And beyond that, any argument that says we should be skeptical about our moral senses could be an argument used just as much so that we should be skeptical about our physical senses. Maybe you are dreaming right now. And so if what your physical senses are telling you are not real. Maybe you just exist in the mind of a giant. Maybe God created us 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age and just put all your memories in your mind. And really, you didn't eat breakfast this morning. You just think you did. You didn't grow up in Atlanta and in Gadsden, Alabama. You just think you did. Maybe. But without the presence of evidence for such a thing, then you have every reason to believe that your physical senses are telling you the truth. And without the presence of a defeater in the moral arena, you have every reason to believe your moral senses are telling you the truth. Atheist philosopher Louis Anthony says this: any argument for moral skepticism, that is, for not believing in objective morality, any argument for moral skepticism is going to be based upon premises that are less obvious than the reality of objective moral values themselves. Therefore, you would never be justified in accepting moral skepticism. That is to say, objective morality is very obvious to you, and any argument someone else makes for moral skepticism is going to be less obvious than how obvious objective morality is to you. And therefore, since that's the case, you would never be justified in accepting moral skepticism. Okay. Okay, not much. I'm going to keep going. To push even further, if you believe in human rights, if you believe that humans have rights, if you believe that others have rights, and you have rights, and I have rights, and that we're different than animals, then you must believe that God exists, according to this argument. Because why indeed would that be the case? If all we are, again, is the product of evolution and just animals further along the evolutionary trail, then why in the world should we be treated differently? Should we act differently? Should we have any sort of moral obligation that animals don't have? Right? Animals are not morally obligated creatures. Craig says when a lion kills a zebra, it kills it. It doesn't murder the zebra. When a shark forcibly copulates with a female shark, it forcibly copulates with her. It does not rape her. Because for the animal, none of these things are obligatory or forbidden. Right? There's no moral aspect to these things. And if that's the same as what we are, if we are just, again, animals, if naturalism is true, then these evil things that we see as evil, like murder or rape, are just ingrained socio-biological patterns that evolution has put into us. But they aren't moral. They don't have a moral capacity. They aren't objectively binding, right? So then, when the murderer, when the serial killer flouts the herd morality, he's not doing anything more than acting unfashionably, right? Then marching to the beat of his own drum. That's really all he is, the murderer, the rapist. Just marching to the beat of his own drum, just not falling into the herd morality. He's just being unfashionable. And if that's the case, then there's really no such thing as human rights. The Holocaust wasn't really wrong. It was just against the herd morality. Is it better for a mother to feed her baby, to pick her up and to care for it, or to eat the baby? Which one's better? Because that happens in the wild all the time, right? Animals do it all the time. Why does it feel different to say that a human mom eats her young and a snake mom eats her young? I don't know if snakes do that or not. I assume they do because I hate them. Why is that different? Why is it different if I go home today and I eat some chicken for lunch versus I go home and eat a human? Jeez. Why do those things feel different? Is it just because I'm a human? Right? Or is there more to it than that? I mean, Why isn't the gazelle laying on the couch of the psychiatrist saying, "You're not going to believe this, but a lion came through and just tore Freddie apart the other day, and I'm never going to be the same"? Why aren't gazelles impacted in the same way that we're impacted by trauma? Why? 2 days ago, my dog Rose defecated on the rug in the kids' room. New rug. Took a dump on the rug. You know what would happen if I took a dump on the rug? I would just never come over that. I'd never get over that shame, right? But dogs don't really feel shame. Not, right? Dogs, she was upset when I got home because I yelled at her, the dog. But like 5 minutes later, she was totally fine, jumping back and forgetting all about it. She wasn't 2 days later thinking, I can't believe I dumped on the rug, right? There wasn't any sort of shame, Rose isn't at home right now contemplating her existence or thinking about how she should live or if God exists. My dog Rose doesn't think about those things. She's waiting to eat and she's chilling. Doesn't think about much at all. She's similar to a man. She's not doing much at all. Because animals just don't, according to the Bible, the human has something very different than the animal. The Bible calls it the imago Dei, the image of God placed upon him that causes him to feel shame and guilt and think about things, about God and about his existence, about how he should or should not act in moral capacities that animals simply don't. And goodness, it just seems like such a stretch to think that evolution has brought us there. If there are no human rights, then we wouldn't have gotten involved in World War II. Or we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. All that stuff would have no meaning if there was no God and therefore no rights. The founding fathers left England because they believed King George was not treating people correctly. They weren't saying it was their opinion. They were saying that he violated the rights given to them by the Creator. The Allied troops decided to go to World War II because the Nazis were convicted of, quote, violating the human rights defined by the moral law. The truth is that you know that humans have rights. You know there's such a thing as right and wrong. You know there's such a thing as good and evil. There's certain things you should and should not do, regardless of what it means for your chances of survival. You know that if your next door neighbor was harming someone that was harming their child, that you should do something, even if it doesn't affect you at all. So if you don't want God, fine, but you can't have right and wrong either. You can't have objective morality either. You can't have real human rights either. This is, again, the most convincing argument for many because it's so hard to deny what we feel inside. We all have this sense of, I think it's C.S. Lewis calls the sense of oughtness. That everywhere we go, there's things we ought to do and ought to say and ought not to say and ought not to do. And there's a way we ought to live our lives. That's the moral law that is, in my opinion, undeniable without a lot of work. And even then, after you convince yourself that morality is subjective, you don't live that way. You don't believe that according to how you live your life. So, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Or, just word it like this, by far, the best explanation of what we experience as morality is God and not anything else. Okay, longer episode. Apologies. I don't apologize. I don't care. Love you guys. Talk to you soon. I'm going to go drink some tea.